All right, welcome back, everybody. Happy Monday or Sunday night, whenever you're getting a chance to watch this. So we're continuing on with the 1970s. We have three more presentations this week. Today's is going to be kind of short, but I want to keep everything focused on particular topics. What we're going to talk about today is kind of an interesting thing about the 1970s that is always an interesting piece to talk about. I gave you a couple videos, clips that go along with today's presentation that it's really important that you watch, that I think you'll find kind of interesting because we're going to be talking a little bit today about the proliferation of crime and violence during the 1960s, or 70s rather. Now, if you remember when we talked about the 1930s, we talked about something called the Robin Hood syndrome, where bank robbers became kind of um, almost heroic figures in society because they would rob these banks that everybody blamed for the Depression and causing the Great Depression. Well, one of the strange things about the 1970s is there was this massive growth, this massive influx in um, crime, and not just regular crime. We're not talking about robbing banks and things of that nature, but more specifically, violent crime, cult-related crime, serial killings, things of that nature. Really, a lot of kind of stuff that's really popular today, and true crime shows and stuff like that. I know a lot of you guys watch, different things on Netflix or different other true crime stories that kind of talk about some of these people and some of the things that they did. Um, and It's really interesting because uh, the 1970s, again, were kind of a strange time. And this strange obsession that the public has with these criminals and the various types of crime are very emblematic of society during the 1970s. Okay, so let's talk about this. Is kind of more of a thinking exercise in today's discussion, right? Uh, so really, because of all the cynicism that's kind of very present in society during the 1970s, we see this really series of unique and different crime waves that are violent, deadly, and strange grow throughout the United States. Um, we're talking everything from, like I said, serial killers to cult-related crimes to um, hostage situations became more commonplace. Uh, all these different kind of just weird, strange crime activities, and society became really enthralled with it. You see copycat criminals. There's uh, a rise in these prolific serial killers, people like Ted Bundy that go all across the country and kill all these different people. And they all kind of come to the surface during the 1970s, and in many ways become big time kind of celebrities in a sense. So where does this come from? Well, like I said before, I got cynicism underlying there. Basically, cynicism, if you don't know what that means, is people generally being critical of just life in general. And for good reason, people feel this way. You have to understand the mindset of the 70s. We're coming out of the 60s, which was a tumultuous decade. We've seen recent assassinations of, very, very important figures in our society, from Martin Luther King to Robert Kennedy to JFK a few years before that. Um, we see, uh, economic turmoil and people not being able to get out of that. We talked about with OPEC and stagflation and other economic crises of the 1970s, or not having enough gas or energy. We see Vietnam War and the Vietnam War not going particularly well, which adds to people's cynicism about various aspects of life. Okay, so all this stuff kind of added together people's general negative attitude about um, a lot of the directions that the country's going in this time adds to kind of this strange obsession with these charismatic cult leaders and killers and whatnot. Watergate, people have no trust in the government because the government is something that's supposed to be reliable for people, and Richard Nixon has defied the public trust through the whole Watergate scenario. So that's another negative. Okay. Um, so one of the big ones, of course, that we have during the 1970s is proliferation of cults. There were cults of all kinds in the 1970s. Uh, there was a popular religion on, well, now I'm going to call it too popular, but there was a religion on the West Coast that grew in popularity called Satanism, founded by a guy named Anton LaFey, and people that worship Satan as opposed to Jesus. That's kind of weird. Probably the two most notable, the three most notable. For one, you kick off the 1970s kind of right at the end of the decade, at the end of 1969, you have the Manson murders, Helter Skelter, and all that. If you saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the movie that came out last summer, it's all about that. So, the cult of Charles Manson, the guy basically painted himself as another version of Christ, and his followers are drugged, were hopped up on drugs and kind of followed along with Charles Manson, and they killed 9 people in between Christmas and New Year's of 1969. So we're starting off the decade with this big national news story of these famous or of these people getting killed, including a famous actress named Sharon Tate and the heiresses of the Chef Boyardee fortune, I think. Um, so another one would be a girl named Patty Hearst. She was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, who was a super wealthy um, uh, news conglomerate owner, owned all the newspapers and whatnot. One of the wealthiest families in the country. Hearst got involved in this group called She Disappeared, um, and there was a ransom note put out for her return. They wanted money, in this group called the Siamese Liberation Army. And then a few months later, Patty Hearst, I'll show you a picture of it later, Patty Hearst is seen robbing a bank with the members of the people that allegedly um, kidnapped her. And it turns out she was a member of this group, or more or less. Probably the most notable cult of the 1970s was the Jonestown cult, led by Jim Jones. In 1978, they moved down to Georgetown, Guyana, in South America, and founded Jonestown. Um, and basically, this Jim Jones, was this charismatic cult leader who made all these claims. Again, as many of these cult leaders do, about you know God was talking to him, and he's a modern day Christ, and all these other things. Um, when family members back home um, were concerned about their relatives that were involved in this cult, they called Congress and the news and somebody to do something about it. So a congressman went down along with a news detail to kind of see what was going on. Ultimately, this resulted in violence, where the congressman was killed along with several other members of the news detail that night in Jonestown. Um, yeah, everybody at Jonestown, under Jim Jones' direction, drank this Kool-Aid laced with cyanide, and when the authorities came back the next day to this Jonestown, everybody was dead. Um, that's where the term "drinking the Kool-Aid" comes from. So you see all these cults that emerged in the 1960s there that are extremely strange. Almost 1,000 people were members of this cult were killed at the Jonestown massacre. Serial killers were another big group in the 1970s that became popular and prominent. And people were obsessed with their numbers. You have serial killers that were really prolific in number. Now, the definition of a mass murderer or a serial killer is anybody who kills more than um, more than 2 people in separate on separate occasions or something of that nature. There's different definitions for it. But in the 1970s, we become immersed in enamored in all these stories of these different serial killers and murderers. People like Ted Bundy, who maybe killed as many as 85 women during the 1970s and 80s. Um, he was a handsome-looking guy, and even women were like enamored with him. When he was finally caught, and he broke out of, he escaped from prison a couple times. When he was finally caught, when he was on trial, there would be women outside of the courthouse being like, "Marry me," and things of that nature. This dude kills women, yet there's women that are so enamored with him. The 70s were a strange time. Um, you've got people like John Wayne Gacy, who was they dug up some like 25 bodies in his backyard. He was a mailman, and no, I'm sorry. Um, he was a circus clown that uh, that was known in the city for doing, dressing up as a clown at kids parties. David Berkowitz in the summer of 1976 and 77 was responsible for the Son of Sam murders in New York City. He only killed about 6 people, but he had the entire city of New York gripped in fear during the summer, where he would write these letters to taunt the police, to taunt the police about the crimes he was committing, and et cetera, et cetera. So that has all these people terrified, um, and many others. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, killed as many as um, anywhere from as many as 50 to 80 some young women and prostitutes in the Seattle area in the late 70s and early 80s. Wayne Williams, an African American serial killer who got arrested in 1981 at the age of 23, claiming to have killed about 20 to 25 people. So again, it's this period where you have just the strange obsession with these mass murderers and killers that make a lot of news and headlines. And of course, Hollywood is going to jump on this train as well. Now, a strange outcome of this, just like we saw the popularity of gangster films during the 1930s, because people liked gangsters and bank robbers and things of that nature. Uh, we see the popularity in the 1970s emerge of horror or slasher films. Most notably, a movie like Halloween comes out in 1978, which features Michael Myers, who's a serial killer. Why do serial killers stand out? Because they kill to kill. They don't kill with a particular motive, which makes them terrifying. But films want to films want to gain popularity through these types of stories. They resonate with the public, and they're extremely popular in the midst of the 1970s. Okay, so here you got this is Patty Hearst, footage of her when she was robbing a bank while she was allegedly a victim of the Siamese Liberation Army. Here's David Berkowitz here, the son of Sam. He would write these letters to taunt the police. Ultimately, he said he was told by his neighbor's dog to do it. Um, and the neighbor's dog was Sam. That's where Son of Sam comes from. It's just weird. There's Jim Jones in Jonestown, this kind of shanty town cult place where they found 1,000 dead people that killed themselves on the instruction of Jim Jones there with the kind of Elvis look. Ted Bundy, a lot of women thought he was this handsome guy that was really a terrifying person. Wayne Williams, um, African American serial killer that was a young guy. He's actually still alive, still in prison in Georgia today, serving life imprisonment. And Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. He, I believe, also is still alive, serving life in prison in Washington. So, anyway, that's all I have for today. So we're going to shut things down, and I'll be back tomorrow to talk a little bit about movies or TV. I forget which one was next. All right, folks. Be well. See you.